Hey everybody, it's Mr. Matthew again for our MCAS review video, and specifically this is the video from molecules to organisms, structures and processes, video number 7. And really this is going to be a video all about cell respiration. So the specific learning objective is to use a model to illustrate that aerobic cellular respiration is a chemical process whereby bonds of food molecules and oxygen molecules are broken and new bonds form, resulting in new compounds and a net transfer of energy. So we're going to break down what all of these terms mean in this explanation, and we'll talk about some of the key processes involved. So here we go. So the key learning objectives that we're looking at here is we want to make an emphasis on the conceptual understanding that the inputs and outputs of cellular respiration, and what are they? So when we talk about inputs, in input, we are going to put in a carbon chain molecule, something like glucose, and we're going to put in oxygen, and that's going to produce carbon dioxide and water. And specifically, we are calling this aerobic cellular respiration, which means that it has to have oxygen in it. That word aerobic links right to this word oxygen. And when we look at cell respiration, it is going to be the process of taking this glucose and breaking up the bonds and turning them into smaller little carbon molecules. As a result, we're also going to produce some cellular energy, and that cellular energy is going to be in the form of ATP. I'll talk a little bit more about ATP and what that means in just a minute. Now, this right here is using words, but oftentimes you will also see these as formula. And so if you were to see this as a formula, you would see that we have C6H12O6, that is the chemical formula for glucose. O2 is the formula for oxygen. And then we would see carbon dioxide is CO2 and water is H2O. So you could see this in either word form as inputs and outputs, or you could see it in chemical formula in here. And we'll talk about other ways of representing this in just a minute, but this is just your initial understanding that what we're going to do is we're going to put in a carbon chain, in this case glucose. We're also going to put oxygen in, that means it's aerobic, and we're going to produce some CO2, some water, and again this ATP over here, that is our key energy output. Now, to show this, we could do this in a lot of different ways. So we could do a few different models. Those models could be chemical equations like on the previous page, or we can also use something like a conceptual model. So here we have a conceptual model where I show you glucose going into this box. I got oxygen going into this box. I got ATP coming out. I got carbon dioxide and water coming out. Or I could switch this around and get a little bit more nitty gritty and say there's some specific metabolic processes that take place in a cell. These are things like glycolysis. Glycolysis is where we break the glucose down initially. The Krebs cycle or citric acid cycle, which is a process that takes place in the mitochondria. The electron transport chain, that's another process that takes place in the mitochondria. And we see the inputs and outputs of them. But note, the things that go into that box and come out of the box are still the same. This is still a model of putting glucose and oxygen in, getting carbon dioxide and water out, and producing ATP as a result. So even though I've added a lot more fancy stuff to this diagram, what goes in and what comes out haven't really changed. And so the key understanding that you need to know is when you look at something like aerobic respiration, you're putting in a molecule like glucose, you're putting in a molecule like oxygen, you're producing carbon dioxide and water, ultimately really as waste products to get that ATP out. And again, this is something similar to what we see on the previous page, except for I've now shown you that here's a molecule that of glucose has that C6H12O6. I see 6 oxygen molecules. I produce 6 CO2s. I produce this 6 H2O. And then again, if I want to do it right, I'd add a little ATP here on the end. And so this is showing you in chemical equation what ends up coming out as a result of this. So there's different ways of doing it, conceptual models like I have on top, or maybe a chemical formula here on the bottom. Now, I mentioned earlier ATP, and we've shown ATP in a few different ways, and we could model how ATP is used for the energy transfer in this molecule. So what ends up happening in here, and I've got a lot in this diagram, and you really don't need to know too much about this, but what you should know is that when we think of ATP, what we should think of it is as a full charged battery, something that is a rechargeable battery, something that the cell uses. We don't destroy ATP. What we're going to do is we're going to add on a phosphate group, That's what this thing right here is. And we're going to tack that onto an ADP, and that's going to allow us to charge our batteries. So when we undergo cell respiration, what we're doing is we're charging our batteries. We're getting fully charged batteries, and then these will go around and they will be usable within the cell in order to power activities. And so let's say I want to pump something out of the cell, and I want to pump it against the concentration gradient. So I want to pump some molecule that the cell has inside, but I don't want it in there, and I need some energy in order to pump that out. I'm going to use the battery, the ATP, to power the pumping out of that molecule. Now, after I've pumped that material out, my battery is now going to be depleted a little bit. I'm going to go down to ADP. How do I charge the battery back up? I go through cell respiration. And so I'll go back through cell respiration, and cell respiration will recharge that battery, bring it back from ADP back up to my full battery, and now I can use this for any of the cell activities I have. Again, I use the idea of pumping something out of cell, but maybe I want to build molecules. If I want to build molecules, building a molecule might require some energy. I might need to invest some ATP. If I want to bind two things together, ATP will allow me to power anything I need to do in that activity of the cell. All right, so that's what you should think of an ATP. ATP is a fully charged battery. ADP is a slightly depleted battery, and going through aerobic cell respiration helps me recharge those batteries very readily. All right, so when we specifically started with our original learning objective, we mentioned food molecules. And so let's talk about what we mean by food molecules. This could include sugar, lipids, or fats, and protein. So when we consume food, it usually has one of these three components in it, either a sugar, a fat, or protein. Often it has many different components of that. And so each one of these types of molecules can be used for energy. Now, in most formulas, like the ones we've seen before, we're going to use the most common way that we think about cell respiration is to use a sugar, specifically glucose. And so over here I have a diagram that shows what sugar looks like in chemical formula, where you see a long series of carbons that are bound together. Glucose happens to be a 6-carbon molecule. And when I take that 6-carbon molecule here, I combine it with oxygen, I get my CO2, H2O, and my ATP out. And so that's the most common way you tend to see food molecules being converted into cellular energy. But it's important to know that while sugars are long carbon chains that I can use to break apart and produce ATP, it's important to know that I break those carbohydrates up through a series of chemical reactions. As I showed you in the earlier model, the conceptual model that said we go through glycolysis, and then I use the citric acid cycle and oxidative phosphorylation. I've got an extra chemical reaction that goes in here as well that happens between glycolysis and citric acid cycle. When I go to do that, I could put in different types of molecules into these processes and still get ATP out. So when I look at something like this molecule, which is a long chain, this happens to be a simple polypeptide, or in other words, a simple protein that has a long carbon chain. Each one of these little elbows is either a carbon or in some cases a nitrogen. But I've got all of these carbon molecules here. So if I was to chop this up and break it down into amino acids, which are the building blocks of proteins, I could enter that into some parts of glycolysis or into pyruvate oxidation or into the citric acid cycle and be able to produce ATP through my aerobic cell respiration. I could also take this molecule, again, long carbon chain, and this is a fatty acid. And a fatty acid is a building block of most lipids. And so again, you see all of these carbons. So depending on how I chop this up, I could add this into the citric acid cycle and then again be able to produce ATP as a result. So when you think of food molecules, again, almost always you're going to see this as diagrammed as being glucose, but be aware that not only sugars, but also fats and proteins, because they're these long chains of carbons, can be chopped up and added in. Now, you won't need to be able to take these types of complicated molecules and put them in on a test, but be aware that any long carbon molecule like these food molecules can be put into the part of aerobic cell respiration or into some part of aerobic cell respiration, and as a result, we can gain some energy from that. All right, so let's sum this whole thing up. You can use a model to illustrate that aerobic cellular respiration is a chemical process whereby the bonds from food molecules and oxygen are broken down to form new bonds, resulting in new compounds and a net transfer of energy. And that net transfer energy is from the stored chemical energy that was found in those long carbon chains, and it's turned into ATP, or that charge battery that your cell can use in order to power those cell activities. In here, you specifically could talk about the inputs and outputs of aerobic cell respiration, knowing that those inputs are those carbon chains like a glucose and an oxygen, and the outputs are carbon dioxide, water, and then the charging up of that ATP. You could also explain different models, such as a diagram or a chemical equation, or even a conceptual model that some stuff goes in and some stuff comes out, again, producing that ATP. The model should also include the role of ATP, and know that ATP is that charge battery, something that could power cell activities, and that when you've used up that ATP, it turns into ADP, and therefore you would need to recharge it by going back through aerobic cell respiration to make more ATP, or to recharge the ATP as a recharge battery from that ADP molecule. And then last component you need to know is that food molecules can include sugars, fats, and proteins, and all of those types of food molecules can be used to produce cellular energy. Now, you do not need to identify the specific steps or processes involved in cell respiration. I showed you in this diagram some examples of glycolysis and citric acid cycle and electron transport. You do not need to know those things for the state exam, but again, it's not harmful to have a little bit of extra background to be aware that there are underlying cell processes that take place in that conversion from the carbon chain that you had in glucose into that ATP, or into the recharging of that ATP in order to do cell activities. All right, I hope that was helpful, and I'll talk to everybody soon.